So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our Cambridge Health and Human Development webinar. My name is Kim Keane and I'm the Queensland Education Manager. Before I make a start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered and pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. Please know this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed by email to all those registered after the event. You can ask any questions in the Q&A box as we journey through. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen, but we will have a Q&A session at the end as well if you have any questions. I'm now going to introduce our Queensland Education Sales Consultant, Annie Martindale. Annie, if you could turn on your camera for a moment and give everyone a little wave.
Hi.
This is Annie. Welcome. Thanks, Annie. And Annie looks after the Sunshine Coast, Brisbane and Toowoomba. So you will recognise her if those are the regions that you're from. And I look after the Gold Coast, Brisbane Metro and Northern Queensland as well. Our speaker team, Ben Hegarty, Alison Bedford and Emma Khan, have very kindly produced some video webinar for us, and then they're going to stay on afterwards and together work through a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please be prepared for the end, or of course use the chat as we discussed earlier. So without further ado, let's begin.
I'm Emma Khan, and today I and my colleague Alison Bedford will be walking you through the approach we've taken to designing the history chapters in Cambridge's new humanities and social science texts. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we undertook this work, the Gayabal and Jarrawa peoples of the Western Waka Waka Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the unbroken chain of learning that has taken place on this land for millennia. Both the Australian Curriculum History and the QCAA Senior Syllabus foreground the development of distinct cognitive abilities through the use of an inquiry approach. Hence, units should be planned using an inquiry framework in which students have opportunities to learn explicitly about the cognitions they are being expected to demonstrate in their assessment. The benefits of adopting this approach mean that students are better able to understand expectations and also better able to articulate areas they need assistance with as they develop the metacognitive awareness of their own understanding and skills. These extracts are taken from the QCAA standards elaborations from years 7 to 10. The whole sequence is available in the teacher support materials that accompany the Cambridge Humanities and Social Science texts. As you can see in this example, the cognition becomes more complex from years 7 to 10. In year 7, students are expected to explain. In year 9, they examine, and by year 10, they are engaged in analysis. The QCAA draws on Bloom's revised taxonomy, and we can see here the increasing complexity of the cognitions required over time. As you can see in these definitions taken from the QCAA glossary of cognitive verbs, the process of analysis is much more complex than that of explaining. A year 7 student should be able to describe an event in detail, while a year 10 student analysing the same event will consider specific aspects to identify patterns and relationships, and thus be able to make decisions or offer an interpretation. In ensuring that we are familiar with the cognitions, we are better able to design learning experiences which ensure students are addressing the cognitions relevant to their year level and experience a logical progression in complexity over their course of study. It is not only the cognitions that increase in complexity over time, but also the features of evidence and historical concepts that students must engage with. In this extract from the standards elaborations, we can see that the cognition of explaining does not change. However, elements of that explanation become increasingly complex. A year 7 student needs to explain reasons for change, while a year 8 needs to be able to identify patterns of change and continuity. A year 9 student needs to be able to attribute these patterns to events, individuals and groups. And finally, a year 10 student needs to consider evidence of beliefs and values, which are often only found implicitly in sources. Here again, using the cognitions and standard elaborations when planning ensures that students are working at a level of complexity appropriate to their year level. Using the cognitions to determine the level of complexity required is only the first step. Both the Australian curriculum and the QCAA senior syllabuses advocate for an inquiry approach. While the terminology differs, the phases of inquiry are embedded within both curricula. All inquiry begins with questions, so students understanding how to devise questions is a core skill. Because of this, each of the chapters in the Cambridge text are framed as an inquiry, with a key inquiry question, which the chapter aims to answer. And this is done through investigating a series of sub-questions. To answer these sub-inquiry questions and overall the key inquiry question, students must engage with historical sources to develop both an understanding of the past, but also to analyse and evaluate the evidence to make decisions and arguments about the past. It is for this reason that every source in the history chapters are accompanied by a series of questions to aid not only comprehension, but also critical engagement with the source to help students draw their own conclusions. So if we adopt an inquiry framework, seeing each unit as an investigation aimed at answering the inquiry questions, and we focus on the cognitions students need to develop within that unit, planning can start. Using Wiggins and McTighe's backwards mapping approach, teachers should identify what students will be able to do by the end of the unit. This is not simply the assessment type, for example, writing an essay, but should be broken down into the specific cognitions they will be assessed upon. By considering the evidence students will need to successfully demonstrate each cognition, we can then plan learning experiences which give students the opportunity to rehearse and refine those skills. These opportunities should not be exclusively teacher-directed. Using the gradual release of responsibility model over the course of a lesson, a unit, and the year gives students increasing autonomy and ownership over their learning. The history chapters have been designed with this in mind, providing prompts for activities that can be done with teacher support, activities for small groups or class discussion, and also individual responses. The chance for students to work collaboratively with their peers develops not only their collaboration skills, but exposes them to other ways of thinking and responding that may not be modelled by the teacher. All of these elements have been used in the design of the history chapters. What follows is a worked example of how this approach, supported by the Cambridge text, can be used for your own planning.
This is just a very short explainer of how all these ideas interrelate as you unit plan. So if we understand that history is predicated on inquiry, that means we need to cover the historical skills as defined by the Australian curriculum, which are articulated in our senior syllabus cognitions. We need to move our students through that process. So we begin an inquiry by devising inquiry questions. So we have our key and sub-inquiry questions. We then need to ensure our students have enough substantive knowledge or a base understanding. So when they engage with sources, they can make suitable decisions about how that information is relevant or adds to their own understanding of the historical period under investigation. So that's the comprehending phase. Now, of course, comprehension continues to be developed throughout this process, but that's the focus cognition in these kind of first 2 to 3 weeks of the unit. We then spend the majority of our time engaging with sources. This can be done in a whole array of ways, but we're looking in terms of the 7 to 10 curriculum at the skills of analysis and use of sources and investigating perspectives and interpretations. In the senior curriculum, we're building towards the cognitions of analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. All of this then needs to be communicated to us in the student's summative assessment. So we would have some time preparing them explicitly to ensure that they're ready to communicate their knowledge in the required style for the assessment. Now, this doesn't have to be a dedicated week or more. This could be embedded throughout. You could do a period of source analysis and then some explicit communication practice and so on, rather than having it blocked out here. I've just done this for clarity. So if this is the relationship between our cognitions, our inquiry process, and then we want to have a look at how the gradual release of responsibility fits in, we can see this happening at multiple stages. Of course, an inquiry like this in a Year 7 classroom, it's likely the teacher has devised the questions, and so you'll be providing them to the students and explaining your design choices. By Year 10, perhaps we're looking at collaboratively constructed inquiry questions for the class, or perhaps we're allowing the class to develop some in small groups independently. So we've released to the we do together phase, or perhaps even the I do phase, obviously in their summative research assessment. But we can also use the gradual release of responsibility at a much smaller scale. So for example, in a single comprehending lesson, we may have the teacher provide some information, the students locate some information together, and an individual student communicates some new knowledge they've located. So all three major phases. Here, if we set up our key inquiry questions and sub-inquiry questions, and we develop some base knowledge to build upon, we might choose to structure our source work by inquiry question. So if week 4 is sub-inquiry question 1, week 5 is sub-inquiry question 2, and so on. We could do the gradual release here. So this is the I do phase. The teacher provides the sources and models for the students how to break them down. We might then have the we do phase where students rehearse that, the modeled example. The students have a go themselves with lots of teacher feedback so they feel if they understand the skill or not. We then might look at sub-inquiry question 3 and let them do it kind of more independently as a group. So the we do together phase. And that's a chance for the students to work together and get peer feedback rather than predominantly teacher feedback. And then obviously we're culminating in the student practicing that individually in the summative assessment. Of course, we'd want them to have a chance to have the you do, or the student does it independently at this point, so they get some feedback if they can do it, if they've improved from their initial attempt before the summative assessment. We can do that also at a lesson level, at a week level, at a term level. The gradual release of responsibility works at all levels. So hopefully that helps kind of visually for you put it all together and see how by framing our learning as inquiry, we can embed the cognitions, we can embed the requirements, the skills of our syllabus, give the students lots and lots of opportunity to practice those skills. So when it comes to that summative assessment, they're really ready to showcase everything they've already covered and produce the best work they can.
As you saw in our example, ensuring inquiry questions are well designed is a key element of any successful inquiry. In the teacher support materials that accompany the Cambridge text, these resources are available for teacher use. A key inquiry question should have an open interrogative, that is, a question stem that requires the consideration of a range of factors to make a decision rather than a yes or no answer. A historical concept should be under investigation. This provides the lens through which students will make judgments. The specific content and the scope and scale of the inquiry should also be clearly identified. Sub-questions then need to be relevant to the key inquiry question. If a link cannot be drawn between the sub-inquiry question and the key inquiry question, it is not relevant, or the key inquiry question needs revision. Students often need support in identifying repetition in their sub-inquiry questions. Does each sub-inquiry question consider something different? Questions should also be in a logical or reasoned order, as this makes the inquiry easier to structure and follow. This is particularly important to consider in your own planning to ensure that the unit flows logically. Finally, having planned an inquiry that targets the cognitions, students need to engage with sources. This has been the core focus of the history writing team, providing students with a diversity of perspectives and support in developing the suitable cognitions when engaging with these sources has guided our chapter design. An often overlooked element of inquiry is reflection upon what has been learnt. And so each sub-inquiry question framed within a section or chapter ends with a series of reflective questions that assist students in developing and refining their responses. We hope that having an understanding of the underpinning design principles that have shaped these chapters is useful, not only in your use of the textbook, but in your approach to teaching history more holistically.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben Hegarty. I am the lead history author for Year 7 and 8 in this Cambridge series. In this presentation, I'd like to take you on a tour of some of the chapters, show you some of the key features that are inside, explain why we made some of the decisions we made, and connect to the ideas that Emma and Alison have already shared with us. Some contact details for me there. On this slide, you'll see a layout of the chapter structure that we've followed in these history chapters. At the beginning of each chapter, we have a setting the scene activity. This is ideally some sort of really engaging activity to get our students hooked on the inquiry, to make connections to their lives. There's all sorts of activities. So there are problem-solving activities, empathy activities, activities that encourage students to develop focus questions. Here's an example of the setting the scene activity for the Year 7 Ancient Egypt chapter. This is a history mystery. It's almost like a mini inquiry. So it has a central question: how did Tutankhamun die? There are multiple options, and students have a guided mini inquiry which they can do over a couple of lessons to come up with some sort of theory as to how Tutankhamun died. As you can see here, it takes them through different stages, such as analysing and evaluating sources, synthesising, hypothesising and reflecting. You'll notice too that there are historical terminology, dictionary, glossary terms in the margins as well. They're highlighted in green throughout the chapters. This is the second part of the setting the scene activity. Here are the sources to help with the inquiry. As you can see here, we're trying to get our students to do history rather than just learn about it. So for this inquiry, they use a variety of primary and secondary sources, and they have to try to come up with their own theories based on the evidence. This is the setting the scene activity that's provided in the Year 9 World War I chapter. This is a different type of activity. This is an empathy activity. So at the beginning of the Year 9 World War I chapter, students read an eyewitness account of life in a trench, and it asks them to think about what life was like for someone who was in a trench. There's a making thinking visible activity that accompanies this, where students have to share their thoughts with a partner about what they think about those experiences. After the setting the scene activity, the students then encounter the key inquiry question for the unit. So every unit has a key inquiry question. It's up to you if you'd like to use this for your unit, but if you do, all the content of the unit can be used to help answer that key inquiry question. So your class can try to answer that together. And I'll show you an example of one of these. This is for the Year 7 Ancient Egypt unit. The key inquiry question is, what made ancient Egypt a successful civilization? There's some information here about how to develop a key inquiry question, the features that you might expect to see in a key inquiry question. That helps students get a sense of not just how to answer it, but how to also write their own questions later on. We also provide sub-inquiry questions, and this is what the unit will be made up of. These are the headings for the different sections of the unit. So the students will try to answer the key inquiry question by engaging with each of these sub-questions throughout the unit. Again, we use color coding to model that. And we've also put down here the historical skills, which just align with the QCAA recommendations for that year level. This is an example of a section from the Year 7 Ancient Egypt chapter. You'll notice that it begins with a sub-question. It also has focus questions to further break that sub-question down, and it might make it more manageable for lessons. So in one of your lessons, you might do one or more of those focus questions, building towards answering the sub-question. Here's another part of that chapter. Here's his sub-question: what role did individuals such as Queen Hatshepsut play in making Egypt successful? Again, you'll notice focus questions. Also, you'll see that we've provided introductory contextual information to explain some key concepts which the students might need to help them understand the sources that follow, particularly if the sources are a little bit complex or need a bit of extra context. We've tried to use a diverse range of sources, lots of primary sources, but also some secondary sources. There's a mix of written and visual sources. Wherever possible, we try to provide fairly detailed details about the source information, so the features of the sources as well, and that'll help with the analysis and the evaluation of usefulness and reliability. It also makes them very useful if your students want to use these sources for research and investigations, because they'll have all the details. It doesn't just say this is a picture of Hatshepsut. It'll actually tell you when it's from, when it was made, where you can find it. These sources are then accompanied by responding to the sources activity, and there are lots of these throughout the chapters. Each source in the chapter will probably have one of these responding to the sources activities accompanying it. You'll notice too that in these activities, the cognitive verbs are bolded. We tried to highlight to students where we've used cognitive verbs. So students will, over time, hopefully become more and more familiar with what it means to interpret or to develop or compare or identify. These cognitive verbs generally align with the QCAA recommendations for that year level, though there might be some variety. And I'll show you here an example which is not from the Year 7 chapter. This is from the Year 9 sample chapter, which is on World War I. You'll notice here that the cognitive verbs in these activities are highlighted as well, but not all questions have cognitive verbs highlighted. Sometimes they're there, but they're implied. So, for example, with these responding to the sources questions, question 6 here is, how reliable do you think this journal entry might be as a record of what happened? So that is an evaluate type question. It's evaluating reliability. Question 7, how useful to your investigation is this source? Again, that's another evaluation type question. So the cognitive verb that sits behind those is evaluate, but it hasn't been used explicitly here. But we're still building those historical thinking skills. One thing I think is really great about this series is that we have provided model responses for almost all the questions in each chapter. So your students can check their answers against model responses or suggested responses. And this might help them identify if they perhaps are misunderstanding some of the cognitive verbs. So again, the more they do this, the more familiar they'll become with what these verbs mean and what is intended if a question says to analyze or to describe or explain. Okay, back to the Hatshepsut chapter. This is the second focus question from one of the sub-questions there. You'll see here some more background information to create the context for the sources that follow, provide some information that'll help students make sense of these. Another responding to the sources activity. This one focuses on synthesizing, analyzing and evaluating. So you'll see here there's a table to accompany these sources. There's a guide to how they can analyze them. They describe, interpret, evaluate. And then there's a making thinking visible activity. And this is one of my favorite things about this series, is that these thinking routines or making thinking visible activities are all throughout each chapter. There's at least one per sub-question, often more than one. And these activities encourage different ways of thinking. Now, you might have encountered these before. There are some very common ones like see, think, wonder, chalk talk. You've probably seen those before. So this activity style here, unlike the responding to the sources questions, this encourages collaboration, it encourages creativity, working with other students or a whole class, engaging with the sources in a different way, presenting their ideas in an interesting form, synthesizing evidence, finding the central idea of a source. So this one here, after the students look at a bunch of sources on Hatshepsut, there's a podcast or a role play activity where they look into other female pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And just because I like the making thinking visible activities so much, I'll show you some more examples of the activities that occur throughout some of the other chapters in the series. This one here is from Year 7 also, but from the Ancient Rome chapter. So here, students create a script for a podcast or role play with an ancient Roman woman. In this making thinking visible activity, we use an attitude scale. This is from the Year 7 Ancient Egypt chapter as well, but in this one, students look into the ethics of the sale of ancient coffins and ancient artifacts. And this is a physical activity. They'll have to get up in the classroom and present their view on whether or not ancient artifacts should be sold. Here's another Year 7 Making Thinking Visible routine. This is a headlines routine. So this one is to encourage students to get to the heart of an issue and show that they understand what is most important about it. So in this one, they make a headline based on the reign of Ramses and the Battle of Kadesh to summarize what the most important aspect of it is. And they can then go on and use that headline and create a magazine or newspaper article from it as well. This activity here is another ancient Egypt activity. This one's a color symbol image. This encourages students to present their ideas in a creative way, to show their understanding of a concept by showing what they associate with it. So a color, a symbol, and an image. Here's another attitudinal scale, this time from the Year 9 sample chapter. This is looking at a moral dilemma. So in the Year 9 and 10 chapters, you'll find some of these attitudinal scales based around ethical and moral issues, which are really great and get your class talking about what they think. Here's a few more examples. These are from Year 8, from the Medieval Europe and Black Death unit. So a chalk talk and generate, sort, connect, elaborate. These activities are great for getting the students up on their feet, up on the whiteboards, trying to brainstorm their ideas, connect their ideas. This is a +1 routine, which is really good for getting students to share their knowledge with each other and to try to build knowledge collaboratively, collectively. So that's just a few of the Making Thinking Visible activities. There are so many. Each chapter, like I said, has at least one per sub-question and normally more than that. So heaps of these. And you can use these as templates or models for all sorts of other activities that you might want to do with your class as well. And hopefully it helps, helps encourage student engagement by providing them with a range of different ways of thinking and presenting, creating, engaging with the sources. Back to our chapter structure. So we've had a look now at setting the scene, the key inquiry question, the sub-questions, the use of sources and how we engage with those through cognitive verbs, making thinking visible activities, responding to the sources activities. Now onto reflections. So at a number of points in each chapter, we ask the students to reflect on the inquiry, and this happens in two different ways. At the end of each section or sub-question, there's a reflect on your learning activity. Now these can take different forms. The first example here is from a Year 7 chapter. The second example is from a Year 9 chapter. You can see that they look different, but they do the same thing. We just want to encourage the students to stop and just reflect at different points in the inquiry and think about the direction and the emphasis of their learning, what they think about the question so far after they've looked at this sub-question. You can choose whether or not you want to do this with your class, but the option's there. We think it's a good idea because it helps build that historical thinking approach, which can be really useful when they do their own independent research investigations, and we want them to be constantly reflecting on their learning and how the sources have shaped their ideas. We also provide opportunities for students to reflect at the end of each chapter, where you'll find a reflection on all of the sub-questions and on the key inquiry question overall. So we get the students to try to synthesize all of the content, all the sources they've encountered, and think, well, what's my view now on the key inquiry question? This is an example from Year 7. It's a little bit more structured. If I compare it here with an example from Year 9, you'll see that it's less structured. It still does the same thing. The students are still reflecting on their thoughts on the inquiry and how their ideas have changed, but in a different way. And I think it's good for them to have different ways of doing these reflections, just to model that the fact that there are different ways that students can do this, and they can choose the way they'd like to do it when they do their own independent inquiries. Back to the chapter structure, and the last feature of the chapters is the assessment section. For each chapter, we've tried to provide one or more sample assessment items. They can be exams or assignments. I'll show you here the Year 7 end of chapter assessment. So you'll see here that we have a project. This is a creative project where students create an Egyptian artifact as well as a museum object label. We've given the students some structure here as well to look at the features of the source and also then to talk about the usefulness of the source. The second project that we have provided in this chapter is another research project into a particular pharaoh, so Khufu, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Ramses, or Cleopatra. And in one, students will look into the life of a pharaoh and create an oral presentation about their achievements. There's also a practice examination question here on Hatshepsut, and the sources for this question come from the sources in the chapter itself. And again, you could use this as a practice exam. You could use this as your own summative end of term exam as well, if you like. Also in each chapter, we have a large range of digital resources, a number of quizzes, extra questions for each section of the chapter, sample responses as well, and lots of other additional materials also. This is the sample assessment for the Year 9 Wobble 1 chapter. You can see here that this chapter provides 2 sample assessments. One of them is a more conventional research essay, and it provides a scaffold for how students can go about developing a question and following it. And the second example here is interesting. This is a Year 9 version of an independent source investigation, where students select 4 main sources that help them answer some sub-questions and do an analysis for each one. And we model this here. And this connects to the IA2 research investigation that students can do in Year 11 and 12 history. So as you can see, lots of different types of potential assessment items at the end of these chapters, which you can use as is or modify for your own purposes. To conclude, I'd just like to finish with a few of the things that I think are real highlights of these chapters. The first one and the main one is the huge range of sources that you can find in these chapters. So the authors have trawled through sources to select the best ones that they can for each of these inquiry questions. Lots of visuals, lots of primary and secondary sources, written and non-written, a huge range. The number of sources can vary from between 50 to 100 per chapter. So very useful for classroom inquiry. Also, what I think is really useful is if you want to do one of these chapters as a research task, so say you're doing an ancient Egypt research task or a Year 9 Wobble 1 research task, with so many primary sources, particularly in these chapters, this could be a really good resource for your students as they do their research. And it can save a lot of time because for our students, finding those sources is probably the hardest part of any research inquiry. So you've got this ready-made huge collection of very high quality sources at your fingertips. These chapters are broken into the sub-questions which connect to the key inquiry question, and you can follow that as it is, or of course you can just pick and choose elements to work into your existing units as well. So I think it's really versatile the way that these chapters can be used. I really like the question and activity design throughout the chapters. So it focuses less on comprehension, more on analysis and evaluation, critical thinking, ethical thinking, problem solving, presenting ideas creatively. So lots of different types of questions and activities that students can do. I like that we have these cognitive verbs throughout, lots of different ways of modeling thinking for our students. And just a final comment is that in Year 7, the first chapter is very closely aligned with the proposed Deep Time History of Australia topic that looks to be coming out next year. So for those of you who don't have resources yet for that, I think you'll find this Year 7 textbook quite useful. Thank you very much. hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you feel like you understand the structure of these textbooks a little bit better now, and that this might be something which appeals to you.
So thank you very much. That was fantastic. Lots of deep insight into the new workings that we'll be developing and creating for everybody. So it's really exciting. I am just going to pull up a little bit of information about the sales end of the series. So what sets the series apart is obvious things, the local Queensland authors, the Queensland content, which is something that we haven't seen before, particularly in this subject area, rich digital resources, which Cambridge are particularly good at. It's very exciting to watch things grow and become. And we are certainly very great at that. Source-based inquiry approach for history, which is fabulous. And also the consistent use of cognitive verbs, which we know is really important here in Queensland. It's something that has definitely come out of all the information events and evenings that we've had, all communication and contact that both Annie and myself have out there with teachers, heads of department. It's really the one of the main factors that people are concerned about and really want to be able to have throughout the series. So that's definitely something that we've focused on. So I just want to briefly show you the pricing options so that you at least have an idea of what these products will look like. So in the print and digital format, it's $64.95, the digital only $51.95, and that includes not only access to the PDF textbook, but the interactive textbook as well. So there's some note taking, there's a few little extra additives that, like we were saying about the rich digital resources, Cambridge are very good at. So if you're interested in looking at that digital interactive side of things, be sure to reach out to either Annie or myself and we can come out and do a little presentation in school with you or with the team and really show you around what the platform looks like and how you might be able to integrate that into the school system. I will just formally introduce the authors now before we go into the Q&A session, because I didn't get a chance at the beginning to do that. So firstly, Alison, if I could get you to just turn on your camera for a moment and little wave. Alison Bedford's taught modern history for more than a decade and has served as a review panel chair for the QCAA. She holds a PhD and lectures in secondary history curriculum and pedagogy, preparing the new generation of history teachers. Emma Khan is Head of Religious Education and an experienced modern history teacher at the Glennie School in Toowoomba. And Benjamin Hegarty is an ancient history teacher at Stuart Holmes School in Brisbane. He's been the Vice President of Queensland History Teachers Association, QHTA, Brisbane Central District Panellist for Ancient History and organiser of QHTA's Ancient and Modern History student seminars. So thank you all for contributing to the webinar, but we can now open up to Q&A, and I can see there's a few questions sitting in there, so I will hand those over. What have we got here first? I can see we've got a few answers that have already come through. Are the sources accessible in some courses at the lower levels? In some courses at the lower levels, I find that the sources are sometimes too academic for students to comfortably engage in. Would anyone like to respond to that one?
I will. Yeah, so I was the lead author for the Year 7 and 8 textbooks. Yep, having looked at the chapters for Year 7 and 8 from my own chapters and the other authors, it's all based on our experiences with our own classes. So the sources are mostly pretty short and sweet, and they've all got a purpose. And the questions help get students to think about the sources as well at I think a range of different levels, so they can engage with them in superficially or to a great depth. So yeah, the answer to that is yes, they're age appropriate from year 7 to 10.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, even if there are some more challenging sources scattered throughout kind of the entire 7 to 10 suite, because we've taken that cognition-centered focus, the questions they're being asked about the sources, a year 7 student would still be being asked to describe and explain that really gives them a chance. You've got a whole range of sources, as Ben said. We've got between 50 and 100 sources in each section, so that really gives you lots of opportunity to differentiate, and you've got options to give students more accessible sources. There's some quite challenging sources, particularly as you come up through the 9 and 10 textbooks, and obviously the cognitions increase there. And of course, as part of your own teaching practice, you can, if the source is quite challenging, you may like to scale back the cognition, rather than asking them to evaluate. Maybe we want to focus on comprehending with that source if it is proving a little bit too challenging. So we've really tried to cater to students working at all levels, guided by that central cognition, and then having a range of sources that, cater to everybody, as Ben said.
And a lot of the questions too they're very open-ended, so they focus less on just comprehension, although we do have some of those, and more on thinking creatively and critically, and so yeah, they can engage with them to all levels of complexity. Plus we have model answers for just about every question as part of the digital content.
Great, thank you both. So the next one we've got here, great that you have step-by-step guidance at year 7 level. Yes, agreed. They look great. When are they available? So they'll be available from September onwards, one each month. I never like to give an actual number of the date because it never works out. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. So let's just say September and go with that. You will see emails being sent out as soon as anything comes available. We've currently got a chapter sample available that you've probably already received an email about. And as soon as any more material comes through, you'll receive information in that way. So that's great. Are there interactive opportunities embedded within the online textbook? I can say yes, I know the answer to that. But Ben, can you give a little bit more information about what those interactive parts might look like?
Yeah, I'm guessing, yeah, if you're referring to things like quizzes, etc., there are. So the focus, again, with the questioning is around the cognitive verbs, so the different historical thinking skills. And the digital content provides extra content for each chapter. So additional questions, sometimes more complex questions. But there's also quizzes. There's a few different types of quizzes available on the digital content, so students can check their knowledge as well. So the questions in the textbook themselves focus more on the thinking skills, and for sort of, I guess, rote learning or building background content knowledge, that's reinforced in the digital content.
Great, thanks, Ben. Next question. I've never used digital resources in my humanities classroom. Will there be resources to help me learn the platform? Yes, there will be. We have little video clips that our marketing team create and develop, and they'll be part of the platform makeup as well. But both you, Annie, and myself will also come out. If you're within the region that we can actually get to you, we can come out and do a little presentation with you too and help you out if you're wanting to get some more information about working in the platform. Yeah. Are there any more questions? Looks like we've covered everything in there. Well, if there's no more questions, I will let everyone know that as you go out of the webinar, you'll be directed to a form where you can give feedback, and you can also nominate which free textbook that you'll get for coming along to the webinar. So just make sure that you follow all the way through to the end of the webinar and then fill out the form so that we can get all of your details and send you out the book as soon as we have it. So you'll see the link on the screen when that occurs. And please join me in thanking our wonderful presenters and authors for putting together the webinar. And it was at very short notice and they did a great job. So thank you all very much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you.